Now we get the exciting part. We're going to talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're usually presented as a suite, as I just said, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's because they are a suite of ideas. It turns out that diversity, equity, inclusion, I had a hard time. I mean, it seems easy, right? Like just, one day on equity, one on diversity, one on inclusion, which is what we're going to do. Very natural. But it turns out these are actually so interlinked that it's very difficult to separate them. Diversity doesn't work without inclusion. It just doesn't. You actually have to have them together. The diversity and inclusion have to be brought in together or they don't work. Because inclusion is how you keep the diversity around. And the goal of diversity and inclusion both is equity. There's no purpose for diversity and inclusion as they are implemented unless the goal is to get to equity. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion can't really be separated. They are a package deal. They are a single program. When you start to realize that, and we start to realize what these pieces are and how they look, then you can start to understand the motivations and the outcomes. That's where I was talking about developing actionable thinking a second ago. If we understand where this stuff comes from, what are the motivations of the people employing it the way that it's being employed, and we understand consequentially what direction this kind of thinking or implementation will take us, then you can start to actually make a strategy to well, first of all, you'll want to fight back. I'm not even going to say you might want to. You will. If you understand this correctly, you will want to fight back. And unless you are one of them. We can have the McCarthy session tomorrow. But you will want to push back, but you have to know what's going on, the motivations and the outcomes, so that you can do that intelligently. The underlying assumption and goal is, of course, that they're going to try to, like I just said, achieve equity by fostering what they call diversity and inclusion. So that's how they link together. That might be on the rocks. I'm not going to go into it deeply now. We'll come back to it in a little bit. But allegedly, this may be DEI might be on the way out. It might be about to get shifted linguistically to EA. You'll notice that when critical race theory became under a lot of fire, all of a sudden it's something else that like culturally responsive teaching or ethnic studies or social emotional learning that contains some critical race theory or a lot of critical race theory or just is critical race theory, depending on which one it is. And they just gave it a new name. Oh yeah, we're not doing that thing you don't want us to do. It's something else now. Well, DEI, apparently the D and the I, the diversity and inclusion, have a problem. We will uncover that here. And they may be shifting to an EA, equity and anti-racism program instead. So I don't know if that's happening. This is in the scuttlebutt range, but it's got grounding in the literature, as we'll hear, so that may be coming. Of course, now we all have to laugh. Is it DEI, like God, Dei in Latin, or is it DI? Is it diversity, inclusion, and equity? DI, the DI ideology, DI company. You got to put DI in your company. Or is it EDI, EDI, which is the order we're going to cover it in. There's even Jedi, where they've put J for justice on the front of it. But then there was just a paper that came out that about 1,000 people asked me if I did it, saying that calling it Jedi is problematic, so we can't call it Jedi anymore because, as a point of personal privilege, Jedis are intergalactic shepherds and heroes, and they reify white privilege or something like that. And so, can't have Jedi anymore. I didn't write that paper. It's not a hoax to my knowledge. Maybe it is. It's now problematic, but justice is actually an important concept we're going to come back to again and again as well. So it links on to the EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I want to actually get it in your head already that the idea that the J, justice, is actually an extension of, in a particular way, the E, equity. So if equity goes long enough, we allegedly get justice. And that's sort of the idea. So that's what the Jedi program we're not allowed to use anymore is. Like I said, we're going to do EDI. And the reason I want to tell you that we're going to do equity first and then diversity and inclusion second, because natural order that everybody calls it, DEI, diversity should go first. If you don't really understand the goal, the equity part, the goal of it is equity through diversity and inclusion, then it's harder to understand what diversity and inclusion are actually for. So I either had to do diversity and inclusion first and then stick equity last, and that's the DI model, and make it like a crescendo punchline, or I had to just drop the bricks on you and go from there. And it works out better if I drop the bricks. So we're going to go in that order. So tonight's equity, once I kind of give you a little bit of an overview of everything. There is some evidence. I mentioned the evidence and the literature being poisoned. There is some evidence from about 2 decades ago that strongly suggested that DEI or EDI or whatever, diversity programs in general, are probably beneficial in workplaces. And these are going to be quoted, if you're in the corporate world, you're going to know they're going to be quoted all over the place, all the time. Look at how it improved X, how it improved Y. This is where I'm telling you discernment's so important, because if you go back and read the definitions of diversity they were using, of course it did. Because they were using a real definition of diversity, which means that people have different opinions that are somehow germane to the thing. So there's some relevant expertise or some relevant skill, something to bring to the table, but there actually are different perspectives coming as well. And it turns out that that form of diversity not only is valuable in a company, it's valuable, period. There's some result that I read recently, and I can't quote who it is. I didn't intend to bring it up, but I just thought of it. And it was something like that. For every 10-fold increase in population density in a city, you get a 13-fold output in productivity and innovation out of the city. So you have a positive sum scaling up when you bring more people together with more perspectives and stick them together and make them work together. This is true. But it turns out that the existing literature on the efficacy of diversity, equity, and inclusion is appealing to that stuff that talked about one thing, and it's actually implementing something else that's not working. And there was a nice paper in the Harvard Business Review a couple of years, 2017 maybe, or 18, explaining why DEI programs, even at the time, were not returning the results that they expected, and why. That often, and many times, they're making things worse, not better, on the exact promises they were failing to deliver. And there are good reasons for that. There have been some other good papers. The New York Times even reported that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are not working. And if the New York Times reported something like that, then there's probably a problem that they couldn't avoid. And the reason for that is because the definitions underneath diversity, equity, and inclusion shifted. That's why we have to do the linguistic clarity game that's a little bit tedious. But the meanings of diversity especially shifted, where diversity no longer means people who have germane expertise coming in and working on a problem from different perspectives that might be useful or valuable. Like you might see, for example, I don't know if you know what the Santa Fe Institute is, but the Santa Fe Institute started many years ago, and they do these very innovative research projects where they'll bring together, say you got a geology question that's really interesting, open question in the research. They'll bring together a couple of geologists, they'll bring them out to the Institute for a couple of years as a fellow, they live there, and they'll bring in, say, a mathematician and a physicist and an engineer and maybe a marketing guy. And stick those, that's your geology team now. And the idea is that maybe the marketing guy has some wild idea that says, well, if this was a problem in marketing, this is how we would try to solve it. And that's actually a difference in perspective. Maybe it works out sometimes, maybe it doesn't, but they had a pretty good run of coming up with very innovative research as a result, I think, of this kind of extreme experiment in research diversity. That's one definition. Another definition is who you happen to have been born as, because of doctrines like structural and material determinism, create the most relevant difference in perspective that could possibly be. And so we're now going to judge you based, A, on the diversity of demographic characteristics, if and only if, B, you have the correct, authentic political position. You have correctly politicized that identity position. So what you end up with is homogeneous politics. Homogeneous ways of thinking about the world in people who happen to look different or who sleep with different people or whatever the relevant metric of identity happens to be. So they've changed the definition from one to the other, and uncovering how that happened is a lot of what we're going to try to get through. Even that said, though, that a lot of the evidence for diversity, has been positive at least 20, 30 years ago. A lot of it's actually worse than you think. A lot of the studies cited, when I was doing the research for this, I was reading about Supreme Court cases, as you'll hear, and I was reading a paper that was written in a law review in advance of an important decision in 2013 that was called Grutter versus Bollinger, which is a University of Michigan diversity admissions case. And it was referring back to a case that's the landmark that we'll also talk about that was called Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, which was 1978. And the Bakke decision is the kind of main big diversity and education and higher ed decision, and it was key. And so this paper in 2003, anticipating the SCOTUS decision about Grutter versus Bollinger, so some 25 years later, was looking back to Bakke, and then it was saying, well, all this evidence has come out in favor of diversity since, and it's saying, for example, we did a survey of whatever number of students at Ivy League universities and asked them if they thought that the diversity unit in their programs increase, or having more diverse people around them improve their education. And I read this and I thought, which Ivy Leaguer in 2003 or 2 would have possibly said no to that? So this is not, I did enough statistics when I was a PhD in math back in a former life to know that that's not going to generate necessarily usable data. A subjective survey of people who are going to be highly motivated to give a particular answer is not something trustworthy. And then when you see the report, it was like 97% of them or something like this said that it improved their experience. And that's really high conformity. But this kind of subjective things like asking elite college students, did this new elite fashionable thing make your experience better or worse, rather than doing, there were some other tests that were like rigorous educational outcomes, capacity for critical thinking, et cetera, that were positive. But some of the studies are very subjective in nature, and they have to be taken with a grain of salt because they're being applied by activists who don't care that they're very subjective in nature. So what we're dealing with then is something very different than the diversity, where the diversity industry kind of started and what most people would think the diversity industry is about. We're dealing, the transition between these two definitions, in fact, comes out of a branch of philosophy that's not nearly, not quite obscure, but not nearly as well known as it needs to be, which is called neo-Marxism, which developed primarily from the 1930s through the early 1970s. And neo-Marxism developed, and I don't want to get too deep into the history of neo-Marxism, but it developed as a reply to the fact that these researchers, these communist researchers, decided that Marx was wrong about some key points. One of them, as a matter of fact, is that justice and freedom are what they call dialectical concepts, so they exist in contradiction. So if you have more justice, you have less freedom, and more freedom, you have less justice. So you see the attacks on freedom in the name of justice today. That's a neo-Marxist ideology that has come straight down the track from 1930s Max Horkheimer to whoever you listened to on MSNBC this morning. Straight line. They also became, in the 1960s, very aware that corporate capitalism had solved many of the problems of exploitation, mostly by breaking up trusts, which is a huge problem, again, now in new sectors. Financial sector, there's a big problem. Tech sector, there's a big problem. You have certain industries where there's, a very strong concentration of a lot of resources in a very small number of hands. Well, they busted up the trust problem. I guess Teddy Roosevelt mostly busted up the trust problem in the early 20th century. And then the neo-Marxists said, wow, the big exploitations of capitalism have been stolen away from us by these, changes to the corporate structure. And now there's the working class, in Herbert Marcuse's words specifically, has been stabilized. And Max Horkheimer, I just named his words. He said, well, Marx said that the capitalism would immiserate the workers, but it doesn't. It gives them the opportunity to build a better life. It turns out Horkheimer was like, yeah, the American dream is real. And that's a problem, because we can't possibly raise a proletariat who's going to bring us to a revolution if we don't have a working class that's going to be easily agitated into becoming leftist and Marxist activists. They've been stabilized. They've been made conservative. We have to look somewhere else. And Marcuse said, where is that energy? Well, it's in his words, the ghetto populations. It's also in the radical feminists. It's in all these kind of identity politics sectors, the sexual minorities, the racial minorities, and the radical feminists. And he said, well, that's where the energy is. That's where he called them the vital need for liberation. That's where that is. Where do you find the know-how? Well, that's where you find it in the elite college students. And if you can just indoctrinate the elite college students, then go minister critical theory to people like Black Power activists, then we can build, as he called it, a new working class out of this kind of ragtag of identity politics. And so my argument that I've made, and I think it's original to me, is that out of neo-Marxism, coming out of the 60s and going into the early 70s, we have the birth of a new phenomenon in Marxism that I call not cultural Marxism, but identity Marxism, where the Marxism is now going to be done across lines of stratification in identity factors like race, sex, sexuality, gender, fat status, disability status, and that, as Judith Butler had it, that exasperated, et cetera, of more identity categories that you have to list every time in all their papers. And so we're in something very different now. And neo-Marxism's very, as many communist ideologies are, very monomaniacal. As one thought, over and over and over again. Power and oppression are the superstructures that define society. We used to think that was just class superstructure, the bourgeoisie lording over the proletariat, and then cultural Marxism came and said, well, they're setting the cultural conditions so the proletariat won't revolt. And then the neo-Marxists said it's more complicated than that because they're building a stable life because capitalism turns out to work. And what do? And they said, well, identity politics, more or less. By 1977, it had a name, identity politics, that was given to it by radicals who were in the school of these exact neo-Marxists a generation earlier that had been ministered to by these radicalized college professors and students and went on to form what was called the Combahee River Collective, which formed in 1974, named Identity Politics in 1977, and set the stage for intersectionality, which I'm no longer convinced that Kimberly Crenshaw was that creative at all when she came up with it in her landmark paper in 1989, because it was there in 1977 by people she would have been familiar with. In fact, this not very creative thing is going to come up a few more times here. So just to kind of give you a picture, I'm going to read to you from, believe it or not, this exists, Diversity Officer magazine. I found this. I was shocked that it exists. It turns out that this article was written by a guy with a PhD, and it's difficult to read. The grammar is what you would expect in Diversity Officer magazine if you're familiar with this, just like all those education missives that are like misspelled. I'm trying to make sense of it as clearly as possible for you, but this is what their description of the origin point of this new direction of diversity really is. He said, diversity education basically started as a reaction to the civil rights movement and violent demonstrations by activists determined to send a clear message to Americans of European descent that black people would no longer remain voiceless regarding their treatment as citizens. Social change in order to achieve a more stable society prevailed was the rationale for the education. Told you, I don't know what that means. I checked it like 8 times. I didn't misspell anything. A more stable society prevailed was the rationale for the education, which primarily focused on training to increase sensitivity towards and awareness of racial differences. So this shift to identity politics, as a result of the anger and violence on one side of the civil rights movement by activists who were determined to send a clear message that black people would no longer remain voiceless. That's where the seeds of according to Diversity Officer magazine, the seeds of the existing diversity movement came from. But that appeal to the identity politics is the key thing, and that it arose out of that radical identity energy that arose in the 1960s. And partly, though, where he mentions the violent demonstrations, what this actually also represents is actually positive in one sense, is they realized that the violence that they used at the end of the 60s and early 70s didn't work. People didn't like it. And so instead, you had people like Bill Ayers, the Weather Underground or Weatherman Underground, and you had people like Angela Davis and so on, give up their wild lives of domestic terrorism in the literal sense and instead get into K through 12 activism. Virtually all of them went into K through 12 activism from being literally violent radicals. And their idea was, we can't be violent, so let's do the long march to the institutions. Let's take over the institutions and educate generations who will think this way so that by the time we slowly change the culture, we can snap fast. We're at the snap fast phase. Welcome to your cultural revolution. What you also will realize is this grew up then in an administrative, educational, bureaucratical, and institutional environment. If we were doing like lab experiments in biology, maybe in Wuhan lab or something, you would know that where you culture the thing determines kind of what comes out as a result. And this is a very bureaucratic institutional disease. It was built up in human relations and human resources departments in the corporate world and the research that goes behind them. It was built up in public administration overwhelmingly. So it literally directly connected to the theoretical development of the administrative state. This is a bureaucratic and institutional disease, and that is therefore tailored to infect bureaucratic and institutional structures. It's not necessarily that everybody in academia or the corporate world or whatever is a coward or a sellout or a shill. It's a disease meant to infect those structures, and it's very effective at it. Just like when you get sick, it's not necessarily your fault that you got sick, but if you do nothing to make yourself better and you die of that, some of that might be on you. The magazine, Diversity Officer magazine, by the way, tells more of the origin story. They blame the military. They blame Truman. It turns out right after World War II, Truman decided that the segregation in the military was total BS after what just happened. And so he put forth an executive order. I wrote down the number somewhere, and somehow I didn't put it in my notes, so I don't remember what number. It's in the 9,000s to give you some idea. So 5,000 some odd EOs ago. I guess 6,000 probably now. That's a little Biden joke. So what they did was they started to do really aggressive, like integration diversity training sessions that literally they would put people, as they said, in the hot seat. And they would kind of grill them about their racism, or they would grill them, have a minority sit in the hot seat and have them just spill their guts about all the racism they experienced. And what they found out is that this didn't work really well. It turned out to create a lot of division and a lot of problems. And the military, after doing this experiment on the soldiers, had to wheel it way back. But the problem is that the model that the military was like, whoa, too extreme, is the model that actually gets used in diversity trainings today. There are very often hot seats. There are very often people singled out and having to tell their experiences in front of a crowd. They're very often taking the people of one demographic category and setting them on one side of the room while everybody else sits on the other side of the room, and the people on the other side of the room are going to go one by one and confess how they're racist or how they're homophobic or how they've always kind of thought trans was weird or whatever, while all the black or trans or gay people are sitting here listening and finding out that all their coworkers secretly have all these issues with them. And it turns out to be not that psychologically healthy to do. That's actually how these things get implemented. And that's what the military was doing at first, and then we're like, whoa, this is way too extreme. By the 1950s, they backed off from that. The early 1950s, they backed off from that because it caused too much division, too much strife. And this is the way Diversity Officer magazine describes that part. It says, white American participants tended to respond to confrontation and sensitivity training in three important ways. One group of whites became more insightful about the barriers to race relations as a result of being put on the hot seat during the encounters. Remember, this is like 1950 for context, cultural context of what was being gone up against. Another group became more resistant to racial harmony as they fought against accepting the facilitator's label of them as racists. Turns out people who are doing their best don't like to be called terrible things for their attempts. A third group of people became what the military referred to as fanatics. These individuals began advocating against any forms of racial injustice after the training. H.R. Day's research on diversity training in the military indicates that the Defense Department Race Relations Institute reduced the number of training hours and curtailed the use of the hot seat techniques in response to negative evaluations by many participants who completed the training. Diversity training in corporations also began to change as affirmative action laws were being curtailed by the federal government. Little CRT context for you. Critical race theory grew out of this same soil, which believed that, affirmative action came into the picture, in the late 60s going into the 70s. It was very expansive at first, nobody quite knew, and then civil rights law started to grind in and cases started to come out, and some of it started to get pulled back, narrowed in scope. In fact, the scope of what would count as acceptable kept getting smaller, and there were more and more arguments made that from the beginning it was always intended to be a temporary leg up that was in threat of becoming a permanent biased treatment by race, which is directly in violation of the Civil Rights Act that it's supposed to serve. And so critical race theory actually grew out of the soil. And if you read, for example, the introduction, it'll take you about 3 hours. I'm not kidding, it's incredibly long. The introduction to a book called Critical Race Theory, The Key Writings That Form the Movement, you can find them discussed. I think that book mentions affirmative action over 500 times. You can tell critical race theory and affirmative action have a deep historical relationship because affirmative action is the incentive structure that they're trying to maximize around. So diversity training in corporations began to change as affirmative action laws were being curtailed by the federal government. What that means, to read between the lines, is as affirmative action laws were becoming more and more called into question, not that they were even closed down, and that they were being narrowed in scope, Diversity trainers were like, we can fill this gap. We can keep doing this same project. And that's exactly what we'll see with the Supreme Court cases. Diversity and inclusion became literally the tools to replace affirmative action where affirmative action was being ruled against the Constitution or against the Civil Rights Act. They go on and they say, while gender, and this is a very important paragraph, by the way, while gender diversity education began to emerge during the 1970s and 1980s, I went a little too far, hang on. Diversity education in the United States expanded in the 1990s to focus on barriers to inclusion for other identity groups. So the diversity industry here in education started, it says, with gender. We're going to have a slightly competing claim to that, where it actually, a lot of it made its way in through special education. But gender was the first big educational program, at least not on the legal side, of where diversity education started to happen. But it began by the 1990s to focus on other identity groups. This is after intersectionality comes into the picture. Ability difference, ethnic, religious, gay, lesbian, and other worldviews, gay and lesbian are worldviews according to the woke, began to appear in education and training. Some diversity pioneers argue that this is the key part, argue that the broader view of diversity has watered down the focus on race to the extent that it is no longer seriously dealt with in training. And you can go ahead and laugh at how preposterous that claim is. Their assumption is that focusing on prejudice toward other groups does not activate the visceral reaction needed for individuals, organizations, and the society as a whole to deal with core discrimination issues. So talking about anything that's not race isn't volatile enough to make the political change that we want. This is from Diversity Officer Magazine. What a mess. What a mess. But that last part's very important. That thing where other identity groups started to come into the picture, it started with gender. This story, the feminists dragged all this stuff in, whether you believe it or not. The radical feminists dragged almost all of this stuff in. With the trans stuff, it's basically their worst nightmare. They created their own dragon to have to slay or whatever, and it's burning down their whole little commune. And now we've got them saying by the 1990s, wait a minute, we're not focusing enough on race. Or as Gloria Ladson-Billings had it in her 1995 paper called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education, we're not making race, in her exact words, the central construct for understanding inequality, which is what she says is the point of CRT, is to make race the central construct for understanding inequality. So what we're seeing then is, diversity is not really going to be about diversity, it's going to be about race. That's why we're going to see this shifting from DEI to AE, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, to anti-racism and equity. Sorry, gay people, it was only going to be about race from the beginning. Your diversity is soon to be the wrong kind of diversity, just like all of my South Asian friends have told me, or even sometimes East Asian. Where are we on the chart? You're white. What? Very, very brown. How am I white? Oh, you're the wrong kind of diversity. We count you as white because of your cultural values, blah, blah, blah. This is a thing that happens that was a cardiologist who told me that. That was a diversity training for cardiologists. That he was Indian and he's the wrong kind of diversity, so he's white now on the new chart. This is a very rigorous approach to diversity, as you can tell. In other words, his politics were wrong, right? Okay, so what are the goals of this diversity, equity, inclusion movement then? Well, turns out the state of Washington, the famous conservative state on the West Coast, just kidding, the state of Washington implemented in 2018, I think they started it, maybe 19, an equity task force. The governor ordered this. It has since become a state office of diversity and equity. It's actually been implemented by legislation that Inslee has signed into law. This thing is a part of the state of Washington's government now. And their goal, as they said in their equity task force meeting before their delivery of the things to the governor at the beginning of 2020, was that their goal was to establish this so that the need for the diversity office of the state of Washington would last for at least 50 years. And it is now by law. Well, what they say, they tell you the goal. They have a document they presented to the governor. You can look this up very easily. Just type in Washington State Equity Task Force into the favorite search engine, probably the Duck one, and then you will find out that you can actually read their 147-page report they turned into Inslee, and that's what I'm going to read to you from. And the goal, they said, is systems change. Systems change. Participants hoped, they're talking about focus groups dealing with some of the things they were talking about, participants or in the focus groups, hoped the Office of Equity can be a catalyst for change at the policy and systems level. The office would promote the recognition that systems work as intended, and we need to dismantle and rebuild the current one. Did you get that? The goal is what we're doing needs to be completely dismantled, and then we're going to build a new one. Dismantle what exists, build something completely new. So when you read in the Critical Race Theory and Introduction book, on the second page, literally the first paragraph of the book from Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanczyk, that's called Critical Race Theory and Introduction, literally is the title of the book, where that they say that you can't rely on incrementalism or step-by-step progress within an approach like critical race theory, that you have to have true transformative change or revolutionary change. That's what they're referring to. We have to dismantle the existing system and rebuild the current one. Many participants said the mentorship and training for agency leaders would be critical in this work, especially around reorganizing white privilege and white culture. Recognizing white privilege and white culture, since leaders cannot dismantle the structures they cannot see. So this is, again, my claim that neo-Marxism, which is also called critical theory, underlies all of DEI, is incredibly important to understand. Their core rationale is we must completely remake the system to a completely new one that we will oversee with our ideology, which begins with the idea that people who are privileged by the existing system can't see or dismantle the problems in the structure. That is straight neo-Marxism. If you like neo-Marxism, you're welcome to like this. But you can't deny that it is what it is. If you realize that neo-Marxism is bad, then you shouldn't like what's passing as DEI. Remember, this is the statement from a legislatively enacted task force that's turned into a permanent office in the state of Washington with the authority of the governor and the legislature behind it. This isn't like, somebody who makes some tractors in Kansas. So it's not what you think you're signing up to when the DEI consultant comes in and tells you probably have some liabilities and you never know, you got to be careful because you might end up with a civil rights lawsuit or diversity lawsuit, and then you're going to have to pay out. Somebody's going to get fired. They're going to sue you for discrimination, blah, blah, blah. And don't worry, you have all these vulnerabilities we just diagnosed, and we also have a consulting program to tell you how to close all of them. It'll only cost you $25,000 a session twice a week for the next year or whatever, but don't worry, you're a corporate fat cat, you can afford it. Definitely not a grift. It's snake oil is what it is. We're going to come sell you medicine for a disease you don't actually have based on liabilities that kind of do exist, but it depends on the judge. They kind of do exist because of bad jurisprudence that we'll also talk about that lies underneath this. So this is actually big business, though. What I was just saying was not, those numbers weren't really a joke. I just saw a thing that said that in 2020, diversity training alone, just training, not any of the accessory stuff, was over $8 billion spent on it in the United States. This is in 11, when you start bringing in everything else, and I've seen stats going back in the 8 to 10 billion range from 2013 for the whole industry. This is, I don't know what the real number for the whole industry in diversity, equity, inclusion trainings is, but it's certainly 11 figures. We're in the tens of billions of dollars a year are being spent on what turns out to be a fraudulent product. Because the product has been corrupted and they know how to put it in a good package that doesn't look like it's corrupted. This is very big business. But it turns out that's small business compared to the really big business, and that's the relationship that DEI holds to, dare I say these words in public, these letters, ESG and SDGs. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Scores. They are integral to how your company, if you own especially a big one, will have its assets managed. If you don't have a good ESG score, BlackRock and Vanguard won't take you. Goldman Sachs probably will not either, but they will send you a diversity consultant that you can make an officer in your company and raise your score. And if you get your ESG score high enough, then you can have your assets managed. Then you can have access to other things. This is the manipulation that makes all of this move. Why is critical race theory everywhere? Because of ESG. ESG is the linchpin between the cart and the horse. Critical race theory, all the garbage happening in our society, the DEI training at your work you don't want to go to, that's in the cart. There's something pulling the horse, but the pin is ESG. That's what's holding them together. Environmental, social, and governance scores for how you run your organization. And it has everything to do with whether or not you're going to qualify for money to be able to continue doing what you're doing. And we're not talking small money. We're talking literally trillions of dollars. We're talking in the 14 figures range when we start talking about people like BlackRock and Vanguard combined. It's like national governments' budgets between them. What are SDGs? Sustainable Development Goals. That's what ESG serves. That's like the butt of the horse, or maybe where the reins, where it hooks onto the, I'm going to get a tortured metaphor here. It's the whips. It's the whips on the horse, of course. Sustainability is kind of the big driving agenda behind all of this. ESGs are meant to, you get good environmental scores when you're being responsible and sustainable with regard to the environment. You get good social scores when you're doing DEI and making a sustainable and inclusive culture. You get a good governance score when you're organizing your company around these things and taking best practices put out by the same people who tell you how to run a sustainable company in this new technocratic world. So those are the part of the wagon that hooks to the horse. The horse is the people that had come up with all of this crap and are pushing it relentlessly with gigantic bags of cash, for lack of a better way to put it, and armies of activists that number probably just in the tens of thousands. Why is DEI such a big business, though? Well, it kind of has three components, one of which is in the post-civil rights era, there was a lot of hustling around this issue, the affirmative action thing, for example, but there's also legitimate liability questions that came up around the Civil Rights Act that needed to be answered. You need lawyers. So there's the big component that it grew kind of organically there. Partly it's this neo-Marxist, neo-communist, I'll put it, push toward a new sustainable future, and I put the sus in sustainable on purpose, sus meaning suspicious. These people really put the sus in sustainability. It's mostly not organic. It's mostly in its present form pushed by the people pushing things like sustainable development and ESG so that they can reorder the world and the corporate landscape from a what we would call shareholder model to a stakeholder model. And the stakeholders are going to be represented by these technocrats who know how to run everything so that the world won't burn itself up and people apparently won't fight with each other, because if you give them enough critical race theory, they clearly get along better. So in other words, DEI is such a big industry mostly because it has been propped up to be a big industry. And then in the wake of things like George Floyd dying, when you have a moral panic going on, it becomes very easy to pull literally an extortion racket on companies, get them to implement this expensive crap just to cover their liability butts, and again, propped up industry. What's really kind of going on? Well, sustainability is the thing I would call the watchword of neo-communism, which another word for that would be communo-fascism, which is this fusion of communism and fascism, which means communist ends, kind of like we see in China, with either a semi-open market or being achieved through market means. So where we see, for example, that the federal government in the United States can't do certain things, but they can lean on companies, like making you get vaccinated to get on an airplane or something. And then the companies say, oh, if you want to fly, there's only really 3 or 4 big carriers. If you want to fly with us, well, we all require vaccines. So whoops, looks like there's a de facto mandate that the government couldn't actually make, but they can make. And all of a sudden the corporations did the dirty work. Or we can't censor you because of the First Amendment, but Twitter can ban you because they're a private company and they can do what they want. They call this thing a public-private partnership, which if you've studied your Mussolini, you know means fascism. If he could define it in a single word, it would be corporatism, that he then said would fuse with the state. But it's going to have this equity component under the S of ESG. So there's going to be redistribution involved, because that's what equity is about. Therefore, it's communism and fascism together. If that sounds like something you like to bring into the world, please carry on bringing it into the world. But if you realize that's a terrible idea, it's time to fight. This is being wedged not on old Marxist theory. Neo-communism is not communism. It's a new thing. It's not following even neo-Marxism technically. It's following what I refer to as identity Marxism, which is where we've stopped doing the corporatist and cultural analyses of the middle of the 20th century and moved into the identity politics realm. The lines of stratification are racial, sexual, gender, etc., not so much rich and poor, which is very convenient if you're rich. You want the poor people fighting with each other about what they look like instead of being mad at you for screwing them over, say in 2008, and then getting bailed out for it. The idea of neo-Marxism, I already kind of touched on it, was to adjust Marxism for advanced capitalism, which has solved the trust problem, which is not alienating and destroying workers, but actually enabling them to build a better life. It's enabling money as it floats up to the top, as it tends to do, because people spend money and they spend money and it goes up to bigger and bigger corporations. It floats up to the top. The middle class is where it kind of gets to hang out on its way up. The upper middle class, it hangs out a little longer. And some people who are up here, they don't want it to hang out there. They want those people to get squashed and the juice to all go to the top real fast. And that's really kind of the picture. Identity Marxism is the tool that's trying to do this. With communism, those people were the vanguard, Lenin's party. They were ultra-rich, lavish parties that were famous in Moscow during the Holodomor, while the Ukrainians starved. And Walter Duranty wrote the article after leaving one of Stalin's parties, probably, for the New York Times. It won a Pulitzer. Ukrainians hungry, not starving. They still have that Pulitzer at the New York Times. They did not disclaim it. It was covering up one of the worst genocides in history. They still have that Pulitzer. You talk about a shameless organization. Would have been so easy to disclaim that. Whoops, that was real bad. We're out. No, they still have it. Identity Marxism works differently, though. It sees a ton of different identity factors. It sees a ton of different identity factors. And it says every one of these has a power dynamic. And so the differences between you and me as man and woman, the differences between you and me as white and whatever, and the differences between you and me and gay and straight, and the differences, these are the things where power really exerts itself and holds people down. And it's like that famous cartoon with the big guy with a big bag of money over his shoulder and pointing at the one guy and said, you know, that guy's going to take, one guy's got $1 and there's another guy sitting there and he's like, the immigrant's going to take your $1 and he's got like, you know, $80 million in his backpack. It's that game. It's how do you get those two people who are on the lower end fighting with each other economically. So identity Marxism shifts the frame out of economics into identity. And it turns out identity is a very dangerous place to put people fighting because you can't resolve it. There is no resolution to a difference in identity. If your theory, like critical race theory holds, is that white people and black people genuinely cannot understand one another because the power dynamics shape their lives so profoundly differently that they are not able to comprehend one another at all, you have no resolution to the conflict that the conflict theory of Marxism generates between those people. And if those people are fighting, they're not paying attention to the person robbing them. That's how Occupy Wall Street died. They sent in the woke and got them fighting about their privilege with whiteness or straight privilege or male privilege. And all of a sudden their solidarity against Wall Street got dysfunctional and fell apart. Neo-communism is named liberation by the neo-Marxists. Liberation from all axes of oppression, all possible systemic power. Not just rich versus poor, but all the racial, all the sexual, all the axes of systemic power that you could possibly imagine, all the identity ones in identity Marxism, all the cultural ones in cultural Marxism. Liberation from all oppression, also liberation from work, also liberation from reality itself in some cases. If you read Herbert Marcuse, who wrote an essay on liberation in 1969, that's how he describes it. He actually also describes it as socialism without the bureaucracy. Because the bureaucracy is what made the Soviet Union bad, apparently. What it really boils down to, though, is oligarchical technocracy by hyper-elites who are going to order the world to be environmentally, socially, and in governance responsible as they see it, which means, in many cases, to do a critical theory of them in their own benefit. This will include, though, under the S, redistribution across every axis of oppression named by neo-Marxism. That will be determined by the people who get to be the representatives of stakeholders. So you'll have some stakeholder speaks up, or stakeholder has determined, or stakeholder. This is some bureaucrat who's been given power to speak for the black people. This is some bureaucrat who's been given power to speak for the gays. This is some bureaucrat who's been given power to say, well, this will implement, you know, this will cause greater disparity in Brazil than in North America. And so there's an imbalance between North and South, or an imbalance between West and East. This is what they are. The tool isn't exactly Marxism. It's Marxism that's modified into cultural, then neo, and then identity Marxism. But it's the same ideological engine underneath it, which I've named in an essay. If you ever want to read it, it's on New Discourses, called Scientific Gnosticism. That features identity politics as the new science, race science, as gross as that sounds, gender science, etc. None of it's science. It's all crackpot sociology, posing as science. But like I said, this is actually a fusion of communism and fascism into a new thing. It is a communist redistribution scheme being run by a fascist corporatism in an oligarchical structure where the technocrats who run the oligarchy at the administrative level are called stakeholders or stakeholder representatives. Stakeholder capitalism, y'all. It's not very capitalistic. They're technocrats. What this boils down to is that there's obviously going to be this big revolving door. What does this corporate fascism look like? There's a revolving door between states, corporations, and NGOs where big players in each of those get positions in the other thing. And, so you have your people who work at the FDA are former high levels at Pfizer or whatever. I don't want to name any particular company, but you end up, and then, or the more classical one, there's a lawsuit against Harvard, but all the judges were Harvard grads, so they got to protect Harvard, and, that keeps happening because they're a Harvard man before they're a American, apparently. And that's really how all this kind of works. Why does all this happen? Because ESG, and so therefore DEI give them crazy access to power. It works. That's why. Do they really care about DEI or even ESG? Who knows? Some of them probably, some of them don't. But the divide and conquer power that it gives them is amazing. It also provides corporations that are doing shady stuff, say like Disney, maybe filming a movie right next to a concentration camp and then being nice to the CCP the whole time and, doing shady stuff. It gives them a nice moral cover. No, we care about all kinds of social issues. Look how high our S score is in ESG. We're really diverse. Pay no attention to the concentration camp behind Mulan. If you want to read more about that moral cover argument and actually some of this other stuff, I recommend my friend Vivek Ramaswamy's book, Woke Inc. If you haven't read this to understand how this stuff works in the corporate world, you must. It's a wonderful read. So that's kind of a big picture. We'll narrow back in. D&I, diversity and inclusion, are actually meant to establish the key official players in the neo-communist cultural revolution that we're taking part in. In other words, D&I, diversity and inclusion, create the commissariat. They use a tool that communists have used for centuries called entryism to do it. Inclusion becomes a justification to get rid of problematic people, so you have firings, and then when you rehire more people to fill their positions, you have a diversity hiring policy in place that only hires friendlies. That's how they do it. Abolish the police. Force the vaccine. A bunch of people quit. A bunch of people leave. Who do you think when the crisis comes they have to hire more that they're going to bring in? People who are already compliant. That's called entryism. It is a communist strategy to take over institutions. Diversity and inclusion are entryism. Equity is the name of the this is a fancy, difficult thing, proximate objective of establishing this party apparatus, and it's a capital P party. It's neo-socialism. Equity is neo-socialism. Justice, the J, when it's included, is the name of the distal objective, or the consequence of sufficiently long and arduous equity policy. There's a reason for that we'll talk about more later. So equity is neo-socialism. This is a redistribution across these axes of power. Justice is when that becomes spontaneous and happens by itself without an administration or an institution that makes it happen. It's the parallel of communism, neo-communism. And the tool by which it's achieved is diversity and inclusion, which is a entryism technique. The DEI industry, I said, arose in the context legally of a few Supreme Court decisions and some big state court decisions. I'm only going to kind of cover these in detail later, but I'm going to just briefly mention them. For diversity, there was Regents of the University of California versus Bakke in 1978, which I already mentioned. It actually ruled that quotas are illegal, but pursuing diversity as an educational end is legal. So you can have race-conscious admissions in colleges as long as the goal is to increase diversity for educational purposes, which they said that the colleges did have a stake in because it actually improves educational outcomes to be more diverse. But Justice Powell, who rendered that the primary decision on that, or wrote the primary opinion for that decision, pointed out a very different kind of equity, a very different kind of diversity than we would see today. The second one is Grotter versus Bollinger, 2003. That was the University of Michigan case. And that actually reified Bakke and said that underrepresented minorities do represent diversity. And it went on based on what was called a critical mass argument, that in order to have the educational benefits of diversity, you have to have a sufficient number of diverse people, or else they are just tokens. And so all of a sudden you can see kind of where they got quotas in the back door. For equity, the two biggest cases were Griggs versus Duke Power in 1971. This is going to be confusing in a minute because there's a guy named Griggs that's not the same Griggs who it's important to. It's not even a common name. I mean, come on. Griggs versus Duke Power ruled that disparate impact can sometimes be used as proof of discrimination, even if there's no intention. Differences in outcomes equal discrimination must have happened, even if you can't prove intention. That was the big picture of that. And then that got kind of followed up in 1979 with United Steelworkers versus Weber. And that actually ended up ruling that women and historically oppressed minorities can actually be intentionally favored in race-conscious or sex-conscious hiring to make up for past differences. And then there was a big argument on the court as to whether past differences had a statute of limitations or if they would be indefinite. Inclusion actually arose mostly out of special education. Although inclusion education started in gender, inclusion as a program started with special education. Is basically, the question was that you had special ed kids, and I don't want to get too deep into it yet, but how do you deal with the fact that if you put them in a special ed classroom where their special needs are being met, then you're technically segregating them, which is an issue. But if you integrate them into the classroom, integration doesn't work because of their special needs. So you need some other third way that's neither integration nor segregation. And inclusion, which is some just complicated buzzword, we're going to just integrate them and pretend we make it work, was what started that. That was mostly backed up originally by some significant state-level court cases, especially in the state of New York, but it spread from there into other domains, as you can imagine. Diversity and inclusion also arose in the state of California's ethnic studies mandate program. The universities of California have been mandated to do something with ethnic studies since the 1970s or 60s, maybe, I think 60s. And that just got reified into law that all the schools have to do an ethnic studies curriculum now. I think Newsom just signed that. So D&I, diversity and inclusion, have a lot of their basis. The thought is based in kind of the ethnic studies multiculturalism approach. So just so I don't look like a total jerk now that I've called it communism like 85 times, DEI might be okay if it were actually focusing on actual goals of diversity, including people who should be not made to feel awful for whatever's going on, and creating good outcomes that people find fair within the workplace, which is the packaging they sell it to you with. But those positive benefits are limited to when you do them responsibly, and they are not occurring under the current programs. You have to have a very narrow understanding of diversity, or a very functional, I should say, understanding of diversity and inclusion, and a very narrow understanding of equity for those things to work out. And what we have is the exact opposite of that. We have a very dysfunctional, purposed, and ideological definition of diversity and inclusion underneath these trainings, and a very broad definition of equity, which is redistribution rather than dealing with genuine issues of access. And that's a key idea there. I say that it could be okay, it could be good, but it's unfortunate. A lot of this diversity, equity, inclusion, all three of these three big ideas arose within contexts that were already heavily populated by new left activists and scholars and academics coming out of the 1960s, going into the 1970s. So it already arose in a context that wasn't necessarily neo-Marxist, though sometimes it was, but was already heavily influenced by neo-Marxist thought. Because if you don't know about this new left that emerged in the late 1960s, its intellectual father was the grand critical theorist of the 1960s, Herbert Marcuse. And so you're talking about literally Mr. Seriously Crazy Neo-Marxist, we must get liberation by biologically changing humanity to be ready for socialism. That's chapter 1 of An Essay on Liberation, by the way, if you haven't read that joyful book. I did a podcast where I read through it for you in 4 parts, so you can listen to me read it to you and yell about it. I get really mad a couple times. That milieu was already informing the progressives, even if they're on the liberal side of the aisle instead of the Marxist side of the aisle, who were formulating all of DE&I from the beginning. And so we have to understand neo-Marxism and new leftism a little bit. The key ideas are power dynamics, material and structural determinism form everything. There are power dynamics like systemic racism that structure society, and the material and structural, which is a very vague word, impacts of those determine the character of people. So where Martin Luther King says something like that we shouldn't judge by color, we should judge by character, they would say that our character has been shaped by the exact power dynamics that judge by color, so that's not even possible. Character's already corrupted. Character must be unpacked. And as we'll see, whites have to be re-educated, for example, as part of that. If you don't understand that that's the ground in which this grows, you don't understand DEI in application, you don't understand what's happening in your company, you don't understand what's happening in your society. But you have to learn to think like they do in order to understand it and reject it. In other words, you have to understand that when they say diversity, it's diversity as understood as somebody who only thinks in terms of power dynamics would understand diversity. When they say inclusion, it's as somebody who only thinks in power dynamics would understand inclusion. When they say equity, it's how would you redistribute across people, across axes that are understood in a way that only people who are obsessed with power dynamics as the key facet of how all of society works, how would they redistribute things? That's equity. So if you understand it, then you can be discerning. If you understand that they're thinking in terms of power dynamics, they say we need a more diverse workforce. They don't mean we need people who look different. They mean people who have critical theory of whatever their color or sexuality is in larger numbers, because that's the only true diversity for them, because the power dynamic shapes how the people think. And so a brown woman has a very particular set of power dynamics that shapes how she thinks, not just about, her experiences in life, her what you really call lived experiences, but also apparently how everything should be done, how physics works. To take it, or math as a rather extreme example, but there is an ethnomathematics requirement in the California Ethnic Studies curriculum in all 3 West Coast states right now, so even math. To give you an idea of how this goes, I'm going to read a quick piece from the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. It's a wonderful book. They say that traditional mainstream approaches to education, so we can kind of sub in diversity and inclusion as we need to, but traditional mainstream approaches to education tend to imagine the history of policy as a series of incremental steps leading gradually toward improved attainments and ever greater degrees of equity and social inclusion. Critical perspectives. Critical means critical theory, means neo-Marxism. Critical perspectives, however, view policy very differently. Critical race theory views policy not as a mechanism that delivers progressively greater degrees of equity, but a process that is shaped by the interests of the dominant white population, a situation where genuine progress is won through political protest and where apparent gains are quickly cut back. So they are running a program. Progress, according to the critical race perspective for them, is one that it is racial minorities acting in protest against the white population that can't even see its privilege. In other words, conflict theory across race. Hello, race Marxism or identity Marxism.